Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I intended to be when I accepted the invitation, but unfortunately another commitment came up that I was unable to avoid. But I'm very pleased to be able to join you remotely. It's a pity I can't be also involved in the discussions. Can I begin by thanking the Harm Reduction Coalition for arranging this meeting. I think it's very timely, and it's great that individuals are actually accepting the challenge to try and effect some change and generate political and public debate about the need for that change. I've been involved in sort of the drug law reform issue in one way or another for most of my career, off and on. Indeed, I recall way back in 1982, part of a panel discussion at the Auckland Town Hall, which was provided to an audience of about 1,200 people. There were a whole bunch of others out on the street trying to get in, and that was a panel discussion about the merits of decriminalisation of cannabis. So the debate has been around for decades in relation to cannabis. Of course, it culminated in the referendum about the decriminalisation of cannabis in the last election, which narrowly failed. But drug law reform is a much wider issue than cannabis. And I think in terms of the debate that needs to be held, it's important that it doesn't narrow down to cannabis, because that's often where the arguments tend to begin and end. I think I've been asked to speak to you not because of my experience over decades, but rather because I was one of the commissioners responsible for the Law Commission review of the Misuse of Drugs Act. There was a referral to the Law Commission from government in about 2007, as I recall, and that culminated in a report that I did with my colleague Val Sim, another Law Commissioner, in 2011. When we started that review, we had some degree of optimism that we might have some effect on the law as it then stood, and that was partly because the Law Commission was an agency that was being listened to at the time, and also because there was a government that was committed to making some real changes in areas that had significant social ramifications. By the time we reported in 2011, the government had changed, the political and public mood had changed, and I think the opportunity was largely lost. There were some changes made. I think the Psychoactive Substances Act to a degree came out of our report, and there were some other changes to treatment approaches, but at its core, our report really didn't go anywhere. And that was despite the fact that actually there was pretty widespread consensus among those we consulted, not only about the need for change, but what the nature of that change ought to be. Now, it's worth saying in the light of that experience that it's very difficult at the best of times to effect legislative change rapidly in Western democracies. But in areas like drugs, where there are polarised views, it's particularly difficult. And that's partly because in areas where there's strongly held minority opinion, politicians tend to avoid dealing with them. The areas where they lose votes more than win votes. And that's why things often languish, not just for years, but for decades, even though the need for change is self-evident to anyone who looks at it. Well, what did the Law Commission found? Well, picking up that last point, we actually found that found that the Act was not fit for purpose, and that was and continues to be blindingly obvious. We didn't really need to say it. It's out of date. It's been progressively amended and added to and changed in a relatively incoherent way. Broadly speaking, it's simply unfit for purpose. At its core, the problem is that the legislation as it sits, is not based on any rational view of how recreational drug use should effectively be regulated to minimise adverse health effects. There's a sort of bifurcated approach where we criminalise the drugs that it's decided people shouldn't use at all, or we have for recreational purposes, or we have a laissez-faire approach where we don't regulate it at all, or we regulate it in a very ineffective and hands-off way. So what did we recommend? Well, first point to note is that we didn't recommend wholesale decriminalisation. It's probably important to say that at the outset. There is, I think, a perfectly at least tenable argument for saying that in relation to personal use and possession, that the harmful effects of criminalisation outweigh any benefits. But even although that might be a tenable position, it's an arguable position on both sides, and it was a position that we decided we should not adopt. What we did say is first that there needed to be a wholesale replacement of the Misuse of Drugs Act with an entirely different type of regulatory regime, and that Act ought to be regulated by the Ministry of Health and not the Ministry of Justice. And although that might sound like a technical, bureaucratic change, it actually was based on a very strong belief that if the Act was administered by health, there would be a different focus. It was more than symbolic. It was significant because we wanted the approach to drugs to be driven by considerations of health, not considerations of morals or some abstract notion of justice. And in that respect, we did also recommend that the new Act, administered by health, should be aligned with the national drug policy. That at the time had and continues to have an overriding health focus, and at the moment and then it was very poorly aligned with the Act, and so I think shifting the administration of the Act to health, in our view, was more likely to ensure that the law and the national drug policy would act together and not against each other. We also recommended a much more flexible response to personal and small-scale supply, and a response that would be focused primarily on harm reduction rather than on criminalisation. Now, there were lots of other very detailed changes at the margins, but in the end, those were the three key elements of what we saw as an agenda for effective change. As I said before, over the last 15 years or so, there's unfortunately been little movement in that direction. So, as a basis for your discussion, where to from here? I suppose I'm the last person to provide a blueprint for how to effect change because I tried and failed, so maybe I'm not in the best position to indicate how others should try and do it. But I can perhaps provide a few pointers as a basis for your discussions as to how we might progress. The first point I'd make is that it's really important to try and depoliticise the debate. If it remains a divisive party political issue, the prospects of getting considered rational debate are substantially diminished. And I said before that politicians naturally in a democracy avoid issues that result in polarised debate and strongly held positions for and against. And really the only way to avoid that is to try and get all political parties to see that this is a significant health issue causing significant harm and that they have a social responsibility to do something about it. So I would suggest as a starting point that requires dialogue with all political parties and not simply with the parties that you think might have support for your position. And at the same time, I would actually avoid I would avoid seeing this as something that became an election issue or an issue that is going to attract single issue voters. This needs to be something that is seen to be cross-party and not an issue of left or right. That's easier said than done, but I think it's most important that we try. The second and related point is that in that debate and in that dialogue with political parties, and by the way, I would urge all politicians as well to see this as something they should approach on a bipartisan basis. But in that dialogue with all political parties, I think it's important to avoid extreme and non-negotiable issues. The arguments in this area are often nuanced, and change involves compromise. And if that is not accepted, then the prospects to get real change, which might be incremental and might be done in bits over time, are going to be lost. Thirdly, I'd say don't present this as an issue about the rights of individuals. I understand that those who frequently use recreational drugs will see it as an issue about rights, and that is fair enough. But presenting it and arguing it in those terms, I think makes change more difficult. To me, it needs to be squarely presented as an issue about harm reduction in an aggregate sense, and you're more likely to succeed if you marshal your arguments around that key principle. The fourth point, and perhaps the last one, as a recipe for getting change, is that I think it's really important to marshal the evidence about the nature of the harm that we're trying to reduce in real terms and the impact it's having across the country in New Zealand. I mean, various jobs that I've had over the years, including the job I've had most recently in the Independent Police Conduct Authority, I've often visited places around New Zealand that aren't areas that I am customarily in, and that provide perspectives on the world that I'm not often confronted with. And those are often perspectives that you find in small towns, rural areas, provincial areas that people who spend their life in cities don't appreciate. And I've been struck over the last 20 years or so how when I talk to people in those areas, they tell me about the need to deal with the harm being caused by drug use. In particular, you hear over and over about the destructive effects of methamphetamine on their communities. And you constantly hear, why isn't the government doing anything? Why aren't community agencies doing anything? Why aren't we getting the support we need to deal with the harm that this is causing? And of course, the answer to that is because we see our whole strategy is about trying to cut off supply. We don't think about also what we need to do to deal with the harm, and if you like, also to look at the extent to which we can reduce demands. So I think that the need for change is clearly there, and all I can really leave you with is to say there might be prospect of effecting change if we think about it in the terms that I've just outlined, and don't try and get change by turning it into a divisive single issue, party political issue. Thanks very much. I wish you the best for your discussions. I look forward to hearing what comes out of them, and I hope that those few comments that I've made are helpful in that regard. Thanks very much.
The sound issues. So the next speaker we're going to have is, can I call you the esteemed Dr. Fiona Hutton? So Fiona joined the Institute of Criminology at Victoria University in 2003 from Manchester Metropolitan University, UK. Her UK-based research and interests focused on recreational drug use in the nighttime economy, mental health, family support services, education and health needs in inner city areas, outreach work with injecting drug users, the homeless, street-based sex workers, and since joining the Institute, her research has developed around issues related to alcohol and other drugs, gender, harm reduction and drug policy. Fiona is also a mega enthusiast of pickleball.
Now there's something you weren't expecting, right? Yeah, can I just move that?
Absolutely.
Is that yours?
Yes, that's mine.
Sorry, I need to get rid of the esteemed Warren. Am I allowed to move this, Kirsten?
Right.
It's the story of my life fighting with technology and often losing. And all these things that they put in the way, which make teaching and, talking about stuff difficult. Okay, so after that mega faff, so kia ora koutou, thank you to Kirsten for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here today to listen to what myself and other people have to say. So I'm going to talk about the impacts of prohibition from the perspectives of people who have drug convictions. So I just need to say that when I get to talking about the participants, and I have several quotes from participants on the PowerPoints, that these deal with sensitive issues about abuse, about trauma, about prison, about experiences in the criminal justice system, and about the removal of children from the home. So I just want us to all be aware of these things, and also just to say, well, now, those are the harms from prohibition, right? The harms that we never hear about, the silent harms of prohibition. So when we're thinking about these, we can all just be kind to ourselves today. Okay, so that's what we should do after we've been thinking about these sensitive and impactful issues. So before I get started and into my research and participants, I just wanted to say a few things. So I wanted to say these things because I want to be crystal clear and transparent about my stance, right? So I support drug law reform based in evidence, human rights, compassion and understanding. And I also support the legalisation of all drugs that are currently illegal, because the evidence shows that the way that we are responding to drugs and people who use them is causing devastating harm and creating stigma. So I came to this realisation, if you like, or this stance. I didn't just wake up one day and think, I know, I'll support drug law reform. That'll be fun. That'll be a laugh, right? So after nearly 30 years of working with people who use drugs, of researching in this area, of teaching in this area, this is what the evidence tells me is the best way forward. And this is what the evidence tells me will reduce harm. Because what we're currently doing at the moment is causing harm, and causing harm inequitably in our society. And harm often falls disproportionately on people who are least able to protect themselves from it. However, getting to here is easier said than done, right? Especially when you consider what Measham and Stevens say, drug policy and prohibition are influenced by a wide range of issues, not necessarily evidence, science, and rationality. So in supporting evidence-based drug law reform, I am, however, heartened by the fact that even though it may be difficult, I am in good company. So the harms of that our drug laws have been causing have been noted by respected scholars and organisations, both internationally and here in Aotearoa. So Crossan and Bowden, a couple of years ago, drug harm is being created and increased by our drug laws. UN officials concerned that the current drug control approach creates more harm than the harms it seeks to prevent. The New Zealand Drug Foundation, in their recently released report, criminalisation has caused immeasurable harm. The impacts on Māori in particular have been devastating. The Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry in 2018, criminal sanctions should be replaced with civil responses and treatment programmes. So the harms that our drug laws have been causing have been noted for a number of years. And I don't think anybody could really argue that prohibition has been a success. And if any other policy had such catastrophic record of failure, it would have been binned decades ago, particularly in the current climate where efficiency and value for money is highly valued. We can't imagine any other policy that was such a failure that would be so vociferously supported by some politicians. So the harms from prohibition and our approach to drugs then and people who use them is finally being recognised globally and here in Aotearoa. So we could ask ourselves what took them or us so long to realise this. And I don't really have any answers to that question, but I think it's an important question to ask. So what I want to do now then is to look at some of those harms from prohibition, from our drug laws, from the point of view of those who have suffered harms from prohibition and who bear the scars of the war on drugs, which, as many people have noted, is really a war on people who use drugs. So I did semi-structured interviews and a qualitative piece of work with 24 people who use drugs, who have a conviction or convictions for drug-related offences here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So my viewpoint is that people's stories are important, which is why I often engage in qualitative research to foreground people's stories, to listen to their voices, and so that voices that are often silenced can be heard when they are very often marginalised. And I came across this phrase, Te mana o te kupu, words have power, in a presentation by a fabulous young academic last year. And it really resonated with me. Words have power. So they do have power, but whose words have power, or more to the point, whose words are allowed to have power? Whose words matter? And I'll come back to this later. So many people who I interviewed had multiple convictions. So much then for the idea of the law as deterrence. And this person in the top quote here, I loved my interview with him because I went into it a bit naively, I'll have to say. And I just said, I did my usual sort of interviewer spiel. And I said, so if you want to talk to me about your conviction and just tell me the story of how it happened, etc. And he gave this sort of throaty chuckle over the phone. And he said, well, I'll be honest with you, Fiona. In my total life, I have over 136 convictions. So I had to kind of, rethink my approach, really. And this was very common. People had multiple convictions. Got some examples here. 32 convictions in 6 months. I've got 186 convictions and over 200 arrests. So many of these people, though, started with cannabis and cannabis possession offences. And I can't help thinking, imagine how different some of these lives would be if they had not entered the criminal justice system for cannabis possession or minor cannabis offences. So we can see some examples here. So the woman who got arrested for growing 4 plants, the young guy who got arrested when he was 16 for supplying hashish. My first drug conviction was possession of cannabis. Somebody, if you excuse the phrase, grassed somebody up for having house plants that they thought were cannabis plants. They rang the cops and they found cannabis in his friend's room. So they found some cannabis, so I also got cannabis charges. So most people that I spoke to entered the criminal justice system for minor cannabis offences. But many people also noted that offences around the possession of utensils often made up part of people's charges. This participant at the top here, though, their first conviction was for a utensil for a bong. So the police raided the house that they were at, and she said, yeah, because they came round the back into the backyard and the bong was just sitting there. So it was like, tough luck, lady, you're nicked. So possession of utensils were often included in charges. And people were like, well, they just wanted to charge me with as much as possible. They just wanted to make me look bad. So they just, threw everything at me that they possibly could. So this is something that we could really change, even under the regime of prohibition. We really need to stop charging people and convicting them for utensils offences. So, we can see here again, my first conviction, possession. So what are we doing? We're bringing people into the criminal justice system. We're starting them off on a massive path of trauma and harm for possession of mainly cannabis and other substances and for minor drugs offences. So many of the people I spoke to also noted the effects of their convictions and if they went to prison on their families and especially their children. All of the women that I spoke to who had been to prison and had had their children taken from them wanted this to be changed. So they thought that this is something that had to be changed because it devastated them to lose their children. Oh my God. And I can never do this without crying as a parent. And I said, I'm not going to cry today, I'm not. But as Sally will attest, who see me also present on my research findings. I often can't get through them without crying. So I can't read those quotes because I'm just going to be bawling my eyes out. But you can see there the pain, the effects on children, the effects on families. And women said, you know, I really struggled with this after losing my daughter. And it compounded problems. And this particular quote, being after being arrested, I lost my daughter and I just really struggled with losing her. So she had to wait then 2 years for her sentencing hearing, and she went apeshit. Yeah, so she just went on a downward spiral, compounded by the fact that she'd had her child removed from her care and taken into SIFs, even though there were family members that could have taken her, right? So that's also what broke her heart, that she was removed from her wider far now because, you know, there were people that could have taken her. And this man here at the bottom, the children do the sentence far worse than the parents. My daughter suffered when I went to prison. She suffered, not me. And this was also common with the male respondents that I had, who talked really emotionally about the effects on their family. So it wasn't necessarily just a gendered issue. So men were also highly affected by being separated from their children, being separated from their families. For this man in particular, his daughter was sexually abused by the family member she was sent to live with when he was in prison. So he had to live with the guilt of that for, you know, the rest of his life. And sadly, his daughter also passed away when he was in prison. So, you know, talk about the harms of prohibition, things that compound difficulties in already traumatic lives. So there's a number of these silent harms that we never hear about. So we never hear about prohibition. We just hear about evil drug addicts and junkies and criminals. And we don't hear about these wider harms, which is why these voices are so important. So stigma, as you can put, it's like, surprise, stigma was a huge issue. It was a massive issue for people in this study. It's massive for people who use drugs, both in terms of the effects of their convictions and in being arrested in the first place. So this quote at the top there, I won't read it out to you, and you can just read that at your leisure while I'm talking about her story. So this was a woman, she was a middle-aged, middle-class white woman at a day festival in Wellington. She was sitting on a sort of hillock, you know, watching the festival go by, and she put a hand in her coat pocket and she thought, oh joy, there's half a joint in here that I'd forgotten about. So I'll just have a little smoke here of cannabis while I'm sitting watching the music. So she was happily smoking this to herself, and suddenly she became surrounded by police. So a member of the public with children had complained to security, and they had told the police, and she ended up being surrounded by police and then having this kind of experience. So she was basically manhandled, she was dragged out of the venue in handcuffs, she was thrown to the floor, she was thrown up against the wall, and she had all kinds of bruises and so on. And she said to me as well in the interview, she noted her privilege, and she recognised that harms from drug laws are not equitable. And she was like, if someone like me isn't safe, then what on earth is it like for other sections of society? You know, what about other people? And she finished that sentence by saying, God help them. Yeah. And that this is the reality for many people. So this is a young lad who said that his experiences in the criminal justice system, he got a conviction for possession of cannabis and a cannabis utensil when he was only 17. No, sorry, just turned 18. And he said it made him feel ashamed, like he was a failure, that he was letting people down. And there were times when he felt really sad and like he was a failure. And this is interesting, not just because of the stigma around illicit drugs, but also because he talked a lot about using alcohol. And he never said any of these things about alcohol. So, people who use drugs are not immune to the kinds of negative discourses that we hear about some drugs and people who use them. So stigma played out in a number of ways, and also it played out in the consequences so it played out in a number of ways. People, were kind of shunned by their neighbours. This is the woman who got arrested very publicly in her street for growing 4 cannabis plants, and suddenly people were ignoring her. She seemed to be like public enemy number 1. People avoided her. They didn't talk to her anymore. People who lived in small towns, they'd go back to their town even after a number of years, and people would recognise them in the pub or recognise their name. And then other people felt like every avenue was putting me back to drugs. So the struggles after coming out of prison, after being involved in the criminal justice system, everything was just pushing them back into the life that they were trying to leave behind. Because this woman says, I was now a criminal. And I also had that stigma that comes along with being a criminal and a person who uses drugs. So the consequences of stigma and of drug convictions were far-reaching for most of the participants. Even those who were somewhat protected by their more privileged backgrounds still struggled with the consequences of having convictions. So I think this is quite a telling quote at the top here. The long-lasting consequences of my drug use are the convictions. That's the thing that will probably be causing harm to me, well beyond any of the consequences of actual drug use. So the conviction is the thing that hounds people, that dogs their every step. And we can see here, so getting work was really challenging. And people said, even if someone was willing to give you a chance, your conditions, your parole conditions or your probation conditions often meant that you had to report all the time. So you had to leave work and so on. So that prevented you from getting jobs and keeping jobs. Having a drug conviction was the start of no job, of unemployment, which kept me in the drug scene. So people, yeah. So people, tried their best and were just kind of blocked at every turn. So the conviction just blocks people at every turn. Yes, sir. Yes, I'm getting to that. Yeah. So this person says, so I gave up getting jobs. It was self-esteem destroying. Wins told me that I had to get my money. So I had to go to job interviews and I was like, well, okay, but I know what the outcome's going to be here. And it was rejection. It was devastating. I knew it was coming, but it was still harmful. Here we have a quote here, Alex's point about travel. Lots of people mentioned the impacts on travel, particularly to Australia. And this person says, I've pretty well given up that I'll ever be traveling to the States or Japan. Some people even said that when they were being sentenced, judges deliberately sentenced them to more than 2 years in prison, because then that affects how the Clean Slate Act can be used. So there was a woman who was pregnant when she was sentenced to prison, and he deliberately sentenced her, she said, to more than 2 years because that wasn't the sentencing recommendation. So again, the stigma of being a woman who was pregnant, who was a methamphetamine user and so on. So we can see how it compounds into harm. So people basically, I can't work in this industry anymore because police do background checks. I can't go through an agency to rent properties. It's difficult to get car insurance and so on. So there's multiple harms here. And these are quotes from one participant. Yeah. So these are the things that people have to negotiate. So one person has to deal with all this shit, basically, because they have a drug-related conviction. So these are the things, his convictions are entangled in all aspects of his life. And many participants had similar stories about how their convictions affected employment, travel, and so on. So stigma is sticky, right? It gets everywhere. It has a long reach and many tentacles. And the problem with having convictions, as somebody said to me, is that you have to live on the margins of society. So many people who went through the criminal justice system, who I should note are a minority of people who use drugs, had traumatic and difficult lives. So this is just a selection of some of the issues that people talked about that they had to cope with. So toxic home environments, violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, problems with addiction. Father was a violent alcoholic, deaths of children, suicide, and so on. Also, people, when they were growing up, prison was just expected. It was an expected part of your life. It was completely normal. This is what would happen to you. This is your life trajectory. So people had traumatic and difficult lives often that were never really helped or addressed. And if we think about the people who had 186 convictions, 136 convictions, where was the support for them? It came towards the end of their involvement in the criminal justice system after, many years of trying to get help and never being offered help and just being cycled in and out of prison sentences in the criminal justice system. So these things were often not addressed. I'm going to skim over this because I know I'm running out of time and Kirsten will come and rugby tackle me in a minute if I don't get off. But these are the kinds of things that people dealt with. These were the kinds of environments that young people were placed in the name of, kind of justice. These are the things that happen to people, and, we can recognise this into the Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State Care and so on. So several of the participants noted that they had been in state institutions, which, as this guy said to me, was a horrible bloody place. So the boys were made to fight each other by the staff, and they were also humiliated and also sexually abused by staff. This was the start of his journey through drugs, addiction, and the criminal justice system. So how can we ignore these kinds of harms, which then just become compounded the more people are entangled in the criminal justice system? And this is what people said. So the system really just made me want to use more drugs. It just makes you want to use more drugs to cope. The system, if anything, compounded my problems. You come out of jail with a worse habit than you ever had outside. So the criminal justice system was seen very clearly by the people who took part in the study as harmful and damaging. So I'm just like, okay, so is this the very best that we can do then? In 2025, this, you excuse my language, is fucking it. This is what we're doing, right? To stigmatise people, to criminalise them, to shame them, to make already difficult lives harder. This is our answer to the problems and issues with drugs and people who use them. So we must take a different approach to reduce harm and to actually tackle the issues related to drug use. So I want to return to these words. Te mana o te kupu, words have power. Whose words have power, or more to the point, whose words are allowed to have power? Whose words matter? So I hope that in hearing the words of those who have suffered from having drug convictions, that you will agree that they are powerful, that they matter, and that they should be heard. And that these are the words we so often don't get to hear. Just like we often don't get to hear about the harms of prohibition. We are quick to condemn individuals, but never the system. Prohibition is the elephant in the room, unacknowledged, malevolent, and its untold and unimaginable harms, used in political machinations around the world, so politicians can appear to be tough on crime and appear to be doing something about drugs. And every now and again, someone comes along who makes you question whether you are actually following the right path, whether your words do indeed matter. After presenting on these kinds of issues, I've been referred to as biased, as frustrating, and a whole host of other things that I won't repeat in polite company. So these kinds of responses often really made me think, am I doing the right thing? Am I biased? Am I frustrating? Probably yes, I am. But after writing this presentation, after revisiting all the pain and trauma on the transcribed pages of the interviews, I know that thinking critically about drugs, about people who use them and how we respond to them is absolutely the right thing to do. And I came across this phrase. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right because I'm not old enough or posh enough to have done Latin at school, but sapere aude, dare to know. So it's a phrase that was used by Kant in the 1700s, philosopher, and it encourages people to think independently, to engage in critical inquiry, and to have intellectual courage. And also, Kant argued way back in 1784 that many people are bound to ideas imposed by tradition and authority and regimes like prohibition, simply because they lack the courage to challenge them. So I urge all of us in this room and beyond to dare to know and to have the courage to challenge the harms of prohibition that are so often silenced, to move us forward towards much needed, indeed urgently needed, drug law reform. Sorry, I went massively over time there. Thank you for listening.
Kia ora, Fiona, thank you very much. Now, while we're setting up for our next speaker, if everybody wants to just wiggle their toes and fingers or whatever, just while we're doing that, so have a wee move about, and then after that there will be a little break.
Ooh. Which USB is yours, Julian? I don't want to eject yours by mistake. I think mine might be that one.
I think yours is F, yeah?
Yeah, is that
Yeah, I
mine?
think so, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
let's do that.
Go for it.
If it suddenly blows up.
Yeah.
That's the key.
Well, I'll introduce you first. Kia ora again. The danger here is I think Adam and I could break into song with these mics, but we won't. Anyway, I wanted to introduce you to Adam. Adam is a dedicated committee member of the Harm Reduction Commission, Aotearoa. He has significant lived experience of the impacts of prohibition, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. He also likes playing music, namely guitar and bass guitar. Is that correct, Adam?
Yeah.
So, Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you here today?
Kia ora koutou, everyone. My name's Adam. What brought me here today? I have a long history of drug use and imprisonment. I can relate to Fiona's presentation. One of my first convictions was possession of heroin, and syringes. So I can relate to that. I had a history of early childhood abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse at a very young age. I couldn't cope really well at school. I had dyslexia, but I didn't know at the time. So I couldn't really read and write when I left school. And this, it sort of set me up and for failure. And I used drugs to soothe the pain, and very much so. I was self-medicating, and due to the the illegality of it, it brought me in connection with the criminal justice system. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam. So you mentioned being brought into the criminal justice system. Can you tell me a little bit about maybe the first convictions and what that meant to go through that system?
Yes. So I first went to prison in 1989. I got quite a lengthy prison sentence. I ended up doing 9 years, that first sentence. So I was, had trauma as a young person, used drugs to self-medicate. And then once you get to prison, there's drugs. There's drugs in every prison I've ever been in, maximum security jails. As I've said before, drugs are what make the prison system go around. It's all about the drugs in prison.
So you're saying prohibition hasn't stopped drugs outside of prison or inside of prison?
Absolutely.
And you mentioned that some of what Fiona said resonated with you. Was there anything in particular that sort of stuck out that you're happy to share?
Sure. I mean, it's what Fiona was describing. I've done 25 years. I've spent all up in prison, and I've had to do a lot of courses. You've got to do courses to get parole, otherwise you don't get out. And it's, of course, focusing on the drug, not the big picture, But I realised, most of the prison system have got identical backgrounds.
Most of the people caught up
in the criminal justice system have got the same backgrounds. So early trauma, drugs, criminalisation, obviously, and it's almost textbook.
Yeah. I can't remember what I said, but thank you for sharing your story and your thoughts here today. So I've got a few specific questions that I want to ask you. Have you ever been sold substances that weren't what you thought they would be?
Yes, I have. I've been sold substances that were complete rip, like I was ripped off. So then you've got to go and get more money. So you've just lost them. And drugs are expensive, so it's not that easy. I've bought drugs where they've been way too strong and I've overdosed on several occasions. That's unregulated drugs. You don't know what you're going to get.
I'm glad you're here today. Have you ever been pressured or needed to turn to some sort of crime in order to fund that?
Yes. It's a lot of times you'll get what they call a start in the drug scene. Like you'll get a start and they'll give you maybe 5 grams of heroin and your cell, and they'll give you a start and then they want you to keep selling. So it's sort of like you are kind of forced into a situation, and next minute you're right in the middle of it.
And in the middle of it, what do you mean by in the middle?
Oh, selling, you're selling and you've got customers and it's just, 24/7 sort of thing.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
sort of caught up in an underground.
Yes, and it is chaotic. It is chaotic because obviously of the criminalisation part of it. You've got to duck and weave and, watch out for the police. And once the police know you, they're always going to pull you over, harass you. And so it's,
And when you're in that, how does it kind of feel to be in that? Or, are you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are you kind of stuck in that, like you said, in the middle of it?
Yeah, you do. I mean, and you sort of, you get stuck for as long as it lasts. Because it normally doesn't last long because police will eventually get pulled over and searched and pinched, or people inform. They get caught and they give the police your phone number.
So you're sort of going from, would it be fair to say you're going from a chaotic, violent situation to prison?
Yeah, which is chaotic and violent. Yeah. And one a complete waste of time. So whilst I was in prison also, I did learn a lot about drug reform, and I did read up about prohibition and the early, the Harrison Act and so on and so forth. And it gave me a different perspective, learning this stuff. Like you said, Kirsten, you've unlearned a lot of bullshit. And then once you learn, it's like, wow, it didn't let me let it go, if that makes sense. But
makes sense. Can you?
And I could see, I could just see the nonsense. People coming in and out. Oh, what happened, bro? Oh, you wouldn't believe it. And when you first come back in, you get a hard time. Boys will go, oh, you're hopeless, blah, blah, blah. And you get a hard time, but and it just goes on and on and on. And then when you get out, it is, that's all you want to do is use drugs. You just had a hard day at the office, and you want to, after all that trauma, so you're a young person with trauma, you go to prison and get re-traumatized. And I would like to actually bring up another point on that is, like sexual abuse for me when I was under 10, and then you go to prison, and then you're made to, you have to do urines. And if you fail your urine drug test, you don't get parole, stuff like that. But the urine, the way they do the urines is you'll go into a bathroom, you get strip searched, and then they'll sit there and watch you, supply the urine. It's like sexual abuse again. I mean, it's a form of sexual abuse. And coming from a person with that trauma, and you've got three, blokes around, behind you, and they're watching you. Yeah, so that was very traumatic.
Thank you again for sharing that. What was the reason that they told you that they needed to do that?
The urine? Oh, well, making sure that you weren't using drugs, and it was all about the drug, and
And how did that, I mean, obviously you said it was awful. Did it deter you?
Absolutely not. No, it makes things a lot worse.
And you spoke a little bit about the violence in that kind of
environment.
In that, thank you, in that kind of environment. Can you sort of share a little bit more about that? It doesn't have to be.
Oh, the violence?
Yeah.
Oh, it's terrible. Actually, as from my earlier days in prison, I thought it was a lot less violent. As the prison systems, as they grow, they sort of, especially in Australia, they become sort of like Americanized prisons. So everyone's contained instead of, you can't sort of get, if you've got a problem with someone and the jail's open, you can avoid each other. Like if he's at the Oval, I'm at the library, or vice versa. But when you're locked in a small yard, things got to come to a head, and you can't avoid it. And yeah, it's disgusting. The violence can be brutal and traumatizing. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that convicting you and incarcerating you for drug offences did not provide a very good environment for dealing with any of the issues that you were supposed to?
Compounded them. It definitely compounded them. The environment. It's I'd get out of prison and I'd be back within 10 months, or I'd be lucky to last a year, and I would be back in again doing another big sentence. And some of my sentences were crimes to get money to buy drugs. Like prison definitely didn't help. I kept on going back. I ended up spending 25 years, so much, worked. I wouldn't have went on to do that. And like Fiona said in her presentation, it makes matters worse. The stigma, it just compounds things. It really does.
I wanted to ask you something around that, and it was again, it was something that Fiona said. So people having trouble with employment or insurance or travel.
Yeah.
So again, if you're okay to share
anything
about that.
And especially now too, because everything's online. It's easier, probably like in the 90s or late 90s, but now when they started doing police checks online, it's you just got no chance of getting a job, especially if you've got a lengthy criminal history like I have. And going back to Fiona again, a lot of people got 100 plus 160 charges. So when you're going for a job and they look at your criminal record comes up, it's like, I'll call you, mate.
So that stigma and those issues that Fiona spoke to are definitely
Excuse me.
Yeah. Very important man.
Sorry about that.
That's right. So I wanted to ask you, what brought you here to HRCA?
When I first heard about HRCA, I was invited to see if I wanted to join. And when I heard, Julian Buchanan and you, and I jumped at it. Yeah, I jumped at it. I definitely believe in what we're trying to do, and with all my heart. I look at it like people are scared. A lot of people are scared of what we're saying, or drug legalization. But like if I was if I had kids, and I'd hate them to go through the system or go through what I've gone through. I really would. I'd prefer them to go and see a doctor or a nurse or in the health department, other than going down to see old mate,
Yep.
and ending up in the prison, the criminal justice system. I really,
And what has helped you, I guess, get to where you're at now?
I think a lot of it's got to do with, to be honest, I think a lot of it's got to do with age. I haven't got the energy anymore to run a habit sort of thing. It's just too tiring, and I sort of grew out of it.
So not lengthy prison sentences.
Oh, definitely not. No.
And is this now the longest period of time that you've been out of the prison system?
Yes, it is. Yes,
Yep.
most definitely, it is the longest. Yeah.
So again, if you're okay to share, where are you living? What are you up to these days? Apart from, you told me, you're into guitar.
Yeah, I play music. I'm actually living at the Auckland City Mission, the new building, home ground, which is brilliant. I've got a job now, part-time job, working with groceries and fresh fruit and vegetables through the Auckland City Mission, which is great because it's sort of giving me like a little toe in the door, so to speak. So that things are looking up. I previously had a job at the Needle Exchange for about 15 months, I believe. So things are going quite well. So music, this HRCA, and it's going well.
Awesome. Was there anything else that you wanted to?
There is, I suppose you could say that I did, I was a problematic drug user, but even that, I can see that drug prohibition could reduce a lot of that. Problematic. Had I been given prescription heroin, I wouldn't have went on to prison. I would have got on with my life. So I really believe that. And like I say, I'm not recovering from drugs. I'm recovering from drug prohibition. Yeah.
Very poignant words. And I think when we've had conversation as part of HRCA, you've said something a couple of times that we've all started saying. I don't know if you're going to remember the words, but enough is enough.
Yeah, enough is enough. Yeah.
Enough is enough.
What stage is society going to go, all right, this is not working, let's move on? At what stage? I mean, it's expensive, it doesn't work. It's a complete failure. If you want to save the kids,
Save them from prohibition.
Yeah, save them from prohibition, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're part of HRCA. You know, what you offer such great value and wisdom to the space and passion as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I hope that was okay. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Right, there we start.
Okay, kia ora koutou. I'm just introducing Kirsten, who is the next speaker. And Kirsten was one of my master's students in 2000, and was it 16 or 40? Anyway, quite a long time ago. She did a fabulous piece of work about women who inject drugs and stigma. And I've been really pleased to see that she's kept in the space of social justice, striving for reforms in a whole range of areas. And she brings a whole load of expertise, enthusiasm, general fabulousness, and pink hair to the table. Yeah, so the pink hair people can, can bond.
I will go with that. Thank you. Thank you, Fiona.
So I'm pleased to introduce you to Kirsten today. Take it away.
Kia ora, again, and I did say to Fiona, don't tell anybody that I've stolen chocolate from your office, or that you had to bribe me chocolate to finish my masters. That is true. Anyway, so we've heard so far from Warren, Fiona, and Adam on the various harms and impacts of the Misuse of Drugs Act and the recommendations from the Law Commission report in 2011. So I'm just going to continue this afternoon by going over some of the various risks. So some of them Fiona and Adam have kind of already spoken a wee bit to. Anyway, so I've broadly grouped the risks that I'm going to talk about today into these headings, and I'll go through each of these headings in more detail. So we've got the risks of an unregulated market and prohibition, the impacts of criminalisation, and some examples of costs of prohibition. And when I say costs, I'm really only referring to dollar costs here, but obviously there are other costs like human lives costs in prohibition. So there's a few words on this slide, but that's because there's a lot of issues from having an unregulated market. Prohibition results in an unregulated market. What happens in an unregulated market is that there are little controls, no mandatory quality standards, no licensing requirements, and this leads to significant risks in substances. So I'll speak to a few of the issues here. With unknown substances or unknown purity, and Adam kind of mentioned his experience regarding this, this refers to the situation where people purchase an illicit substance or drug, and they assume that the drug is a particular chemical, but the reality often is that it contains something else that has potential to harm, or the substance is what they assumed it to be, but it is much more concentrated or pure. For example, fentanyl or nitazenes, which are both synthetic opiates, have been found in various substances where people thought they were buying something else. People have overdosed due to this. While services such as drug checking, which we do have in New Zealand now, yay, and Know Your Stuff, DISC and the New Zealand Drug Foundation provide this service, drug checking is important to reduce the impacts of having adulterants. However, these services are under-resourced and they can't check every substance, or they can't check certain substances, so they can't get to everyone. Also, in an unregulated market, there's an unpredictable supply. So this is another big risk. Prohibition offers very little in effectively controlling the supply of substances. In fact, both supply and demand of illicit substances have increased under prohibition. And again, you heard Adam about his experience where, going to prison, there was just more and more substances available. So prohibition hasn't reduced this availability or supply. Looking further down the list on the slide, at, say, untaxed money laundering, the control of an unregulated market, the market of illicit substances in prohibition rests in the hands of criminal entities and underground organisations. Disputes, transactions, and all the activities within this market inherently include money laundering and physical violence, just as what was seen in the States about 100 years ago with alcohol prohibition. So that's a broad overview on some of the risks that we have due to an unregulated market. The next group that I wanted to talk about as far as risks go is the impacts or risks of criminalisation. So just obviously there's a wee list up there of how criminalisation impacts people who use certain substances, and I'll come back to that word certain soon. So prohibition criminalises people, which has a ripple detrimental impact on theirs and other people's around them lives. So Fiona spoke about it, Adam spoke about it, that impact diminishes the opportunities for access to housing, access to healthcare, insurance policies, employment, relationships, international travel, a multitude of things. Unfortunately, discretionary approaches to possession only benefit some groups of people. A recent example that we've had in Aotearoa, when we had the 2019 amendment to the Misuse of Drugs Act, which codified the right for police to exercise discretion in prosecuting drug-related crimes. While this amendment did lead to a reduction in some drug convictions, Māori have still been arrested, convicted and imprisoned disproportionately compared with non-Māori, and disproportionately to how people consume illicit drugs. Estimates show that about 50% of drug convictions are for Māori, and approximately 65% of those imprisoned for drug offences are Māori. We're overly convicting Māori, and we're overly imprisoning Māori, not just for drug offences either. It's well known and evidence that Māori in our country are disproportionately impacted by prohibition at all levels of the criminal justice system. So this is even despite the idea of decrim or that 2019 amendment to the law. Māori are more likely to be policed, stopped, searched, arrested, charged, convicted, punished, and imprisoned. And drug possession makes it easier for that to happen. Other impacts or risks of criminalisation is that prohibition pushes people to use in secret or to sometimes use alone for fear of arrest. This can increase harm. And people are reluctant to seek help if they're needed. So Fiona also spoke about stigma. People are also afraid to ring an ambulance if an overdose occurs. This is why HRCA supports Good Samaritan law. So as Fiona mentioned, stigma. Criminalisation exacerbates stigma, and stigma increases the barriers of access to evidence-based, educational and harm reduction information. People are just afraid to say that they use illicit drugs and why they use it. They might be criminalised, they might be pushed or coerced into medical treatment. They can't access support if they do have use issues. And it also impacts on how they're treated in society. And I don't just mean barriers to employment. It is literally just socially. People, they just get treated as though they're less than others who may use illicit drugs. So the third group of risks that I want to go over, just broadly, is I mentioned that I'd be talking about the costs of prohibition. So spending. One of the risks of prohibition is where we put our resources. As a country, we spend a ton on prohibition of certain drugs. Just to put some dollar costs that the Department of Corrections spends, incarcerating someone costs corrections about $160,000 a year. That's on average. For people that...
I'm sorry, I didn't realize that's a lot of drug number.
It is. Good point. So for people that are sent to prison for drug possession as their most serious conviction, this number more than doubled from 334 in 2022 to 688 in the last year. For 465 of those people, this was a 40% increase in the numbers from previous year. Drug use or possession was their only charge. So those people have no other convictions. And just if we imagined that half of those people, so just say if we took 230 people in that number, were incarcerated for 1 year, the cost to corrections of keeping them in prison for 1 year would be $37 million a year. So we as a nation, a country, are putting money in prison, policing, courts, instead of putting money and our other resources into health services, housing and education. Prohibition has also seen the encouragement or perfect situation of industries that punish people unduly and without scientific basis. So one example of that is the meth cleanup of so-called contaminated houses in recent years that saw a massive number of tenants evicted. And more than $100 million of people's money was estimated to have been spent in a now debunked moral panic of houses that supposedly needed a meth cleanup. And the last point on the slide refers to the cost of reinforcing prohibition overall. So I'm just going to show you a snippet from a recently released report. So this was released, I think, about a week ago from the Helen Clark Foundation. So it's called New Zealand's Choice, Funding Our Drug Policy. It shows that reinforcing prohibition is a staggering 68% of our drug policy costs. And if you can see right at, can I even, so see there where my arrow is pointing, harm reduction, that is 1.4% of the money spent. So to me, that's just really stark on where we're putting our drug policy figures.
That Needle Exchange, wasn't New Zealand the first country
Yes.
to start that?
Yes, first to have a nationwide needle. We were brave. We were brave and innovative, you know.
We were.
We can still do that, yeah.
You know, like just,
Absolutely. Here.
let's just get this done, shop.
Yep. And so looking at that total of harm reduction figure, so that's 6.9 million, whereas the corrective services, so further up, about there, is 120 million. So 6.9 million of harm reduction versus corrective services of 120 million. I mean, my brain, and I have an accounting degree, I can't even, 120 million is just phenomenal to be spending on something that causes more harm.
That's a lot of benefits for people who are salaries in this system.
It costs a lot to keep people incarcerated.
I don't need to keep, I have someone who finds it. They do their best, but they do not know what they're doing.
So next, I want to touch on another well-known and consumed drug and a risk of that drug with regards to prohibition. So I mentioned earlier that I was saying certain drugs are policed and prohibited. What about alcohol and prohibition? Prohibition focuses on certain drugs. It perpetuates the notion that alcohol isn't a drug. So we all use it at birthdays, funerals, weddings, meals, parties, passing exams, on greeting cards, get-togethers, any event that you can think of. The expectation is to have a bit of alcohol. And I was even thinking about that earlier this week because I flew in, I don't live in Wellington anymore, and I flew in from Melbourne, and as I was coming in from Melbourne, I am forced to go through duty free, and as you're going through duty free, you've got all the signs, you know, it's cheap ethanol, cheap, and you can take 3 litres of spirits and not a problem. And then there's, you know, you get to customs and it's like, oh, but you better not be bringing in drugs. You better, you know, I mean, there's dogs there. Some of them might be sniffing out for food, but you know, it's such a contrast, and so many people, or as a society, we don't see it. The way we think about alcohol is just so ingrained in our cultural norms. We don't see it or treat it like a drug in the same way that we treat other drugs. Our obsessive and at times unhealthy relationship with alcohol, I would argue, has to be understood within the context of prohibition, because we've marginalised some drug use and some people that use some drugs and not others. So just to sum up, I've provided a brief overview or snapshot at the risks of prohibition. I think many of you here would agree that we don't want people to be harmed unnecessarily. We want to reduce harm to people. We need to think about a way forward where we don't increase or cause harm that can be avoided for people and society. So I'm going to pass over to Julian Buchanan, who's going to speak about a way forward.
I'm over here, aren't I? Yeah. How do I get rid of that?
I will introduce Julian once I find my notes.
That's all right. See you okay? Oh, you've got something to say about me. Okay, there you go. You can make it up, Kirsten. It's all right.
I have got it on
Oh,
purpose.
yeah,
Here we go. Here we go.
Coming.
So I'm introducing you to Julian Buchanan. He's been working with drug issues for 4 decades, initially with people struggling with addiction in the community and in prisons, before moving to academia as a criminology professor. I had the privilege of studying under Julian in my undergrad. He had a focus on drug policy, and Julian's published over 50 articles on the subject, worked as an expert advisor and editor for the UNODC, and has addressed conferences around the world on the subject. He also enjoys brewing craft beers, a legal drug, spending time with the grandkids, and the other thing is he gave up watching a game of Liverpool.
I did. I don't want to know the score either.
Yeah, I don't know the score, so you're fine. But yeah, a huge fan of Liverpool FC. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Kirsten. Yeah, I want to talk about our proposal for changing things in the future, but I need to pick up on some of the things that have been said, and also need to rejig slightly from Kirsten's contributions. I need to make sure I don't repeat too much. But Fiona was saying how important it is that words matter and words are powerful. And I think that is very much at the heart of what we're grappling with in relation to moving away from where we are now to a position of rationality and sensibility in relation to drugs. And within those words are concepts, and within those words are indoctrination and hardwired thinking, within which people struggle to see outside the box. So I'm going to start by trying to move us outside the box And I was thinking about when you go to the cinema and you see those movies where they have 3D glasses, and you look at the movie without the glasses and it's all fuzzy and it's out of focus and it doesn't really make sense. And then you put the glasses on and then you can see it. And then sometimes things jump out at you. And in some ways, it feels to me that in relation to drugs, we need some sort of glasses like that to change the thinking of people, almost like glasses that they can put on their brains, on their lenses within which they interpret and understand what we see. So I'll start by saying there is no war on drugs. There isn't a war on drugs. There aren't people who use drugs like those people over there. We love drugs in our society. Everybody loves drugs in society. Our lives, they revolve around drugs. All our lives revolve around drugs. In the morning, people are desperate to get hold of some stimulant drug. They might have one shot, they might have two shots. They'll be looking to top up during the rest of the day. They'll have breaks in work where they'll have more caffeine shots. They might even have a nicotine shot, another psychoactive stimulant. In countries, different cultures, they won't be taking caffeine. They might be chewing a coca leaf. They might be chewing a cat leaf. Those two drugs are illegal. If you did that here, you'd be in big trouble. But they're just stimulant drugs, no different to nicotine and caffeine. Towards the end of our days, not our days as in life, but towards the end of the day, people are looking for a depressant drug, a psychoactive depressant drug to chill them out, to help them unwind. They might go for a beer, they might have a glass of wine. So depressant drugs like that help us to relax, help us to chill out, help us maybe to fall asleep or become sleepy. And then we structure all our sort of celebration around drugs. If it's your birthday, if it's you passed your driving test, if it's a new year, if it's a baptism, if it's a wedding, whatever it is, if you've been invited to a friend's house, you take drugs with you. You do drugs. You can buy cards, greeting cards, celebratory cards for these events. The cards will have on it alcohol, bubbles, celebrations. People might say, oh, you've got a new job. Well done, congratulations. I hope you're going to celebrate tonight. What does that mean? Go and have a good time and celebrate. It means go and get ratted on alcohol. Now, I'm not trying to have a go at legal drugs. What I'm trying to do here is to say that the people who really struggle with the views that are largely held here are people who do drugs. But they look at me and they look at you, or some of you, and they'll say, but we can't legalize drugs. Well, there's a cognitive dissonance here. There's a mistake. There's something that doesn't quite add up. Our lives are revolving around drugs, and we need to understand that. And we need to shine a light on that hypocrisy, on that double standard. And people use being completely ratted on alcohol, and as Kirsten said, I love alcohol. I make lots of craft beer. But like all drugs, there are times where people use them maybe in ways that are a bit harmful, not just to themselves, but to other people. And so you'll see people who are completely ratted and they'll be staggering. And if you go to A&E, they will tell you that when people are staggering like that, it's very difficult to know the difference between somebody who is off their face with alcohol and somebody who's brain damaged. So they don't know whether that person has been hit by a car or whether that person's completely intoxicated. But that being ratted is a sign of cultural status. I had a bloody good night last night. And then in the morning, oh, you had a good time, did you? And what I'm trying to say here is that isn't it odd how we can glorify and glamorize and accept and accommodate drug use like that, but other drug use, like what Fiona was talking about, people are sent to prison. So society loves drugs and always has done. What did the New Zealand government do when they first became a parliament? What was the first law that they made? Yep. The first law that they did in 1854 was to enable alcohol to be served in Parliament. So that was the first law that the government passed.
It builds on Friday on display in the new bar.
Right. So you can go and see, yeah? This is what we're up against. This level of MPs who will be pro-alcohol. They have their own bar in Parliament, and most governments do have their own bar. It's probably subsidised as well. And those same people who are knocking back drugs will sit there and say, we can't legalise drugs. Drugs are bad. Drugs are awful. So it's a bit crazy in that sense, a bit odd. We can have a debate about sugar, and that's not important to this discussion, but I'd argue that sugar is a psychoactive drug. A psychoactive drug is a drug that impacts your body, but also has impact on your mood and general feeling and well-being. I would argue that sugar in that sense is a psychoactive drug, but it's also one of the addictive psychoactive drugs. Addiction, again, I can't talk too much about that because it'd be another lecture or whatever, but addiction being much more than physical addiction, than psychological, social addiction. But the point of this slide is to say, look, we all use drugs, and we need to get to this position. If we are going to change this law, we need to get people to understand we are all drug users. And you'll see a whole range of different drugs on that slide there. So the so-called war has duped us. It's a draconian regime prohibition, and it's based on propaganda. Propaganda, prejudice, misinformation, stereotypes, they are all hallmarks of oppression. They operate in racism, they operate in colonialism, they operate in homophobia, they operate in sexism. They are the same processes, except in relation to drugs, we are at a stage where the oppression is still embedded within the laws and the policies. We don't see the same level of laws and policies still operating. We still have problems with those issues I mentioned, but those issues are much more cultural and social as opposed to structural in terms of within the laws. There is institutional discrimination embedded within cultures of organisations, but not within the policies and the laws of those organisations. But we do have it in respect of drugs. So you go to your doctor's waiting room and you say, you see a sign which says, drug seekers will not be tolerated. So if you say you've got a bad back or whatever, and they say, oh, you've got a drug conviction, then you're not going to get the treatment that you deserve. So after a lifetime, and it has been that long, of misinformation, propaganda, prejudice, we've been indoctrinated. So the drugs that are illegal, they're illegal because they're dangerous. You want the evidence that they're dangerous? Well, the evidence that they're dangerous is that they're illegal. And so you go around a circular argument because there is no evidence. And what this has done is it's created a drug divide. And actually, I've never used an illicit drug in my life, so I can't say we as prohibitive drug users are prohibited. Users of prohibited drugs. But people who regularly use prohibited drugs, and that's cool, and that's fine. I think we shouldn't be bothered about people using drugs. We should be concerned about problematic drug use or people having difficulties. That's the concern that we need to have. I hope you're not concerned that I'm using alcohol, but I hope you would be concerned if it's messing up my life or messing up people around me.
How comfortable are we with that we have a substance that we use and want to use to find people, and to use it here, to win other local rates and
I'm sorry, I need to carry on. Sorry, we will take questions afterwards. Sorry, I can't easily juggle with trying to listen but we will be staying around at 4:30, and there will be food and drinks, and we can carry on the conversation. Yes, so what I'm saying is we've got this drug divide, and that divide is embraced by both sides of that divide. So I think sometimes as people who use prohibited drugs, we don't recognise and push that the others are using drugs. And the others who use drugs just definitely don't acknowledge that they're using drugs. But the truth of the matter is, and it's been mentioned a couple of times today, Professor David Nutt did 2 studies in the UK, and Rose Crossin and Fiona Hutton and others did this study in New Zealand, and they are both seminal work which identifies and compares the harms of drugs to one another. And 2 of the drugs there in the top 4 are legal drugs. This is the madness that we're up against, is that we've got legal drugs that are more harmful, and we've got loads of drugs down on the far end that are criminalised, prohibited, and people are punished, but they are far less harmful. Now, I'm not arguing that, as you would expect, that the drugs at the far end should all be prohibited, because it would make things worse. And what we've got in one sense is like a war on drugs. It's a war between drugs, maybe, where you've got the approved drugs at the top enjoying their privilege, enjoying their status, being promoted. It's hard for me to watch a TV series or a TV movie without somebody at some point opening a bottle of wine on that event. And so the answer to the problem we've got on this slide here isn't to persuade and to try and drag one of the people below to the castle at the top. That's not the answer.
The LSD guy looks like he's enjoying himself.
Yeah, maybe they are enjoying themselves, yeah, despite it. Maybe he's on LSD because he finds the whole environment a bit too weird. Yeah. But really what's happening up here is there is a war between drugs, and there is a war on drugs. And whenever I write about drugs now, I always try to put drugs in inverted commas, because we are all drug users. But when the media and people talk about drugs, they are talking about prohibited drugs, because what they are taking, they don't see as drugs, and they will not see themselves as drug users. But they are, and what they're taking is just as risky as some of the stuff, or a lot more risky. But this sort of attack on prohibited drugs is in some ways almost like an attempt at annihilation. And the UNODC branch, UNGAS, a special sessions that was held in 1998, they actually wanted to, they had the slogan, "A drug-free world, we can do it." It's hideous. It's dangerous and disturbing, to be honest with you. The idea that you'd want to eradicate drugs from the world. But of course, they wouldn't be talking about caffeine, tobacco, or nicotine. Caffeine. So what we've got really is drug wars between drugs, which privileges and promotes societal use of a particular group of drugs, while policing and severely punishing societal use of other drugs. And it offends me hugely. I mean, to be honest, when I heard Adam speak earlier on, I'm almost moved for tears at the injustice of it all. It's so wrong that people are being treated this way because they choose different drugs. And then particularly people like Adam, who are taking drugs to cope with massive trauma. I mean, it's fine to take these drugs if they're your drugs of choice and you enjoy them. That's why I take alcohol. So your motivation is fine, but it just hurts me even more when people are self-medicating and they're being punished. And this has been referred to, well, the graph hasn't been referred to, but it's been said already that the war on drugs is not only costly, the demand for drugs and the supply of drugs is not going down. This is the UNODC's own data. So it points out that, and this is percentage, it's not numerical, So the percentage of people in the world using illicit drugs is not going down. If anything, over that period, it's going up. And the other thing to point out in this is the UNODC's own data is acknowledging that most people who use drugs are not problematic drug users. You'll see at the bottom there, that very light shaded blue are the people that they call having drug use disorders. Most people who use drugs do not have an issue. So we have a drug law which has utterly failed its objectives, has fueled violence and gun crime, has created a lucrative illegal market, has funded gangs and cartels, and increased overdose and addiction. Would you let a law like that carry on? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's damaging our society so much, as you've heard already. And this graph has been very well received internationally and sort of hits the nail to a lot of people, and they've adopted it from the HRCA. And it's really illustrating that when you look at harm, most harm, and obviously this is a graphical representation, but most harm is prohibition harm. But it sits under the surface and it goes unacknowledged. And as has been said, most of that harm in terms of incarceration, arrest, is targeted at the most vulnerable of our society. I watched the elephant episode on Should We Legalise Drugs? I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a fantastic clip where Tricia Walsh, who was somebody who was struggling with methamphetamine and very traumatized life journeys, was self-medicating for years, committed a whole pile of crimes, ended up incarcerated for years, and she's sorted now, whatever. But she was saying that the situation for Maori in relation to being nabbed all the time for drug convictions and incarcerated, she referred to it as the merry-go-round. And I thought it was painfully sad and accurate, given the number of Maori people who, and this you saw from Fiona's research, people who are known will be arrested and picked regularly, and Adam alluded to that as well. Once you're known, but people are in these communities, often the police, and it just keeps going and going. And it's interesting with Trish as well. In that interview, they said to her, "And Trish, what would you do? Would you legalise or decriminalise?" And she said very clearly, "I would legalise all drugs." I mean, from my own research, my own experience interviewing lots and lots of people in qualitative research, which is, as Fiona says, is really sad and difficult to carry at times, but it's easy for me. I'm privileged, and they're the ones living that life, not me, and it's so hard. But for those people, almost everybody, and Adam said it as well, he said, like, if you look at the prisons, he said, they're all the same people. They've all got the same journeys. And all my work in probation, all my work in the drugs clinic with psychiatrists and prescribing injectable heroin and injectable methadone to people, and oral heroin and methadone, the people's journeys, that they were messed up and struggling before they even started having a problem with drugs. Drugs were a way of filling a void. Drugs were a way of easing the pain. Drugs were a way of creating a busyness and a purpose. Drugs were a way of getting skills. Drugs were a way of being on the go, of having some adrenaline rush. There were a whole pile of things for which were not available to these people in society. They could not find niches, avenues, pathways. But drugs were not their problem. Drugs were the solution to that group of people. And that was certainly, I think, what Adam was alluding to in his personal journey, but also what Trish was alluding to. Tricia Walsh on the elephants. So prohibition would have us believe somehow that the reason why people end up being violent or people end up being criminals or stealing is because of the drugs. But when people are prescribed, and I've had lots and lots of people prescribed legal drugs, when they're prescribed and they're on clean supplies, they don't do those things. When people are prescribed Ritalin or Adderall or methamphetamine, where they prescribe it as methamphetamine in the States, they don't develop meth face, or they don't look like this, and then 5 years on Adderall or whatever, their face looks like this. No, it's all to do with lifestyle. It's all to do with the subculture that is embedded when you prohibit drugs. When you prohibit drugs, you're just driving people completely underground, and the whole culture of unregulated drugs leads to contamination. It leads to people being caught up, fingered on the hoof all the time. It's a whole underground culture which is quite toxic. So we're faced with a stark choice. Who should manage the supply of drugs? The criminal underworld, or should we legally regulate drugs? Now, I don't know about you, but...
Are they the same group?
Sorry?
Are they the same group?
No. If we legally regulated drugs, then you would be able to get the drugs from the pharmacy on prescription, or you could go and get some drugs would be available over pharmacy, or maybe for some drugs, like you can with a very dangerous drug called alcohol, you can go across the road there and there'll be a room there and you can purchase it. And if they think you're in any risk, they'll stop serving it to you, and they'll look after you and whatever. So drugs are available. So
I was just trying to say that obviously the first group is the safest, because what the second group is doing.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sorry, obviously the first group is the safest to run in a supply of drugs, because the second group is doing what they think they're doing at the moment, selfishly, not working, bad, highly paid people doing bad things to lots of people, poor on them, some marginalised people. Obviously the criminal underground will do a better job.
Yeah, we'll have a chat later. I'm not too sure I follow really legally. I use a legally regulated drug. I use alcohol, and I'm not any different to any other people because I use a legally regulated drug. I don't really understand how a legally regulated drug makes you any different to other people. But so for me, this is a no-brainer. It's an obvious choice, and essentially, this is the sort of model we're looking at. Unregulated drugs, you've got no support, you've got no safety, you've got no quality control, you've got no idea what you're taking. Regulated drugs, here you're purchasing them from some sort of social bar or whatever. You could be. I'm saying, can you just be quiet, because I'm trying to get on.
What you're saying is so untrue.
Well, okay, you can talk about it later.
I think the community pharmacies we have done work this kind of that.
I'm sorry, we'll talk about it later. I'm not going to waste and
the safe people are the people not in the system. Yeah, but that's offensive and wrong. And it's
sure.
It's about Indigenous people. It's about marginalised people. You say they don't know what they're doing with drugs, and I don't know how you.
No, look, I'm talking about when you purchase an unregulated drug, you don't know what's in that drug, and that is not to do with your Indigenous status or your race or your class or your gender. If you purchase something, you don't know what's in that drug. And this is why people overdose, because they don't know the purity. And this is why we have drug checking, because people are not sure about the strength or the purity or what it's mixed with. And within that, there's limited safety, and there's no legal regulations of quality control over illegal drugs. Regulated drugs could be sold through pubs or social clubs, but they could also be through prescription, and they could also be through on sale at the pharmacist. And it's for that reason why we certainly we would much prefer legalization than decriminalization. Because decriminalization leaves the supply and the criminals and internationally cartels and gangs. It delivers an unregulated, unknown, unsafe supply, Whereas the legal regulation will have people who can respond and have somewhere to take action if they're not happy about something. There will be consumer rights. There will be legal issues that can be taken to the police. If you get somebody who you hand over 6 grams of heroin or whatever, and they do a runner on you, you can't tell the police about it. But you can take action if this happens with a legal substance. So there's a whole legal framework which we should be pretty familiar with for organised sales of legal stuff. Now, some people have said, well, we could legalise this drug or low-risk drugs. And I struggle to understand why you would say that. Because the more risky a drug, the more reason to regulate it. If a drug is high risk and got lots of propensity to overdose or whatever, then that drug really needs to be purchased legally so you know exactly what it is. Now, I'm not arguing for low-risk drugs not to be regulated. I'm saying that the Misuse of Drugs Act is not based upon risk. As you've seen with the Crossin et al. Research, the Misuse of Drugs Act is not based on risk. So to approach the Misuse of Drugs Act and say, please legalise my drug, it's low risk, is almost like giving some credibility or understanding that this act was about risk. It was never about risk. It's got no science or status or rationale to support the Misuse of Drugs Act. So where do we go from here? What's the way forward? The way forward is to try to hit this sweet spot near the bottom of this curve. The further you go, I was going to say my left, is it your left? It is your left too, isn't it? Yeah, wasn't too sure how these things work. So the further you go to the left, the greater the harms, because prohibition is more harmful than drugs ever could be. And we've evidenced that very clearly today. And you'll see this graph was adapted from John Marks, who's a psychiatrist who I used to work with in the UK, and where in many ways I learned my trade in the mid-1980s when we were prescribing injectable heroin and injectable methadone and operating maintenance and low threshold. But John had a U-curve, which is a standard framework of saying you go up this way and the harm increases, and you go that way, the harm increases. So it's a standard U-curve, and that makes good sense. But I think the problem with projecting that in relation to drugs and prohibition is that it might make you think that the legalization without good controls, drugs are going to create massive harm. So I've reconfigured the graph to show that even with awful regulation of the industry, you would not manage to compete with the harm of prohibition on the left-hand side.
Julian, if the legal drug market is created by kickbacks, what about applying it in reverse psychology and using kickbacks in the illegal drugs?
Yeah.
We're working on it. It's been done at the moment, quietly.
Starting with the politicians.
So,
We got them to it.
legalization doesn't introduce drugs. They're here already. So that's one of the arguments that people make against drugs. But legalization will not be introducing drugs. They're already here. What legalization does is it decides and gives a chance of where you buy them from. At the moment, the only place you can buy illegal drugs is in the unregulated market. So it's important that we move towards legalization, but not worry about introducing drugs because they are already here. And no drug is made safer by prohibition. Every drug is made more dangerous by prohibition. So just to pad out this graph a little bit more, we need to have a system whereby we regulate drugs in a way that doesn't push people into the illegal market. If our regulation system is so punitive or so anxious about protecting or appeasing prohibitionists, then we will have a model of regulation which will fail, which will drive a whole pile of people into the underground market. The purpose of legal regulation is to eliminate the underground market. You will never eliminate it. We'll always be seeking to try to diminish it as much as possible. So as Fiona said, the medicinal cannabis arrangement has led to people who have got needs going into the illegal market because they cannot afford the prescriptions, and they've been prohibited from growing their own unless they can find some defense if they were convicted. But it's a stress and a worry. So we've got to have a legal regulation model which doesn't mean that certain people are going to end up back in the illegal market. And too often our reforms are through a lens of prohibition. We need reforms to be through a lens of health and social care. We can't play with a system, the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is through a lens of prohibition, which has a particular way of seeing drugs all the time. If you go through the courts, you go through Parliament and you create a framework for legal regulation through a lens of prohibition, you can be damn sure that Maori people will be picked up for something or other. You'd be damn sure that poor and working class people will be picked up for something or other. And when we talk about regulation, alcohol, I would suggest, is on that right-hand side of the scale. Alcohol needs to be shifted back down to the middle. Alcohol not only enjoys this monopoly and privileged position, the sponsorships, the outlets, the number of outlets in poor areas, it's ridiculous. So when we talk about legal regulation, it can mean anything to different people. So legal regulation is often used to talk about legally regulating use. I'm not interested that much on legally regulating use. I'm interested in strictly legally regulating the commercial market. That's where the regulation needs to be aimed at. The legal regulation needs to be aimed at labelling, advertising, sponsorships, donations, licenses, production. Really, it's your body, it should be your choice. Nobody should be arrested or challenged over the choices of what they want to do with their body. If it affects other people, we've got a conversation to have. But generally, if it's your body and you want to do whatever, that is your choice. And I don't understand how we can have legal drugs being promoted and accepted and people doing them, but then them incarcerating or wanting to punish people who choose different drugs. As I say, I've not used an illegal drug in my life, but I'm fighting for the rights of people to be able to do what I do with alcohol. So HRC is going to introduce a petition later this week. And the petition is arguing for a new drug law. We're arguing that the old drug laws should be abolished and rescinded. The drug laws should start again. And this is a drug law not for illegal drugs. This is a drug law for all psychoactive drugs. So we need to bring alcohol, caffeine, tobacco, so that we can see this management of drugs. We're all on the same page. Prohibited drug use and currently legal drug use would come under the one single act. It needs to be managed by the Ministry of Health. We need to protect the civil rights, and in protecting the civil rights, largely we're protecting the rights of vulnerable people. So we'd legalise all adult possession, cultivation, production of all drugs for personal use. Now, if that is fully legal, then people have got no reason to be stopped and searched and arrested and handcuffed, like the woman that Fiona was talking about in the handcuffs when she was in Wellington, and like it's not on. We need to strictly regulate the commercial supply, and that's where most of the regulations come in. Of course, there would be regulations of age for individual use and regulations about maybe licenses for production of certain drugs. We need to honour Te Tiriti and ensure that that's built into the process itself, and also make sure that Maori have services run and led by Maori, and we need to also understand and address the issues of Maori and in terms of plants and their indigenous rights in relation to that. We need to base our laws on science, evidence and lived experiences, upholding the principles of harm reduction and human rights, not on hunch or anecdote. I know somebody which is the way often our drug laws are framed. And we need to ensure that our regulations are fit for purpose and don't cause people to turn to an illegal market. That is crucial. I think most of our drug laws and our reforms that take place are so fearful and so conducted through a lens of prohibition that they actually mean that people will end up going to the illegal market. So in some countries, you find that cannabis is legal to grow, but it can't be seen by anybody in the public. Or you can't walk down the road with a cannabis plant, or you can only have X amount. It's obviously you can have some limits on amounts, but the amounts are often very silly and not realistic. And then finally, the petition will be entitled Better Drug Laws. And the title of our petition, I've given you the detail of the petition, but the petition is simply that the House of Representatives rescind existing drug laws and create a new single drug law for all drugs. And I think being under health and being all drugs helps to create a paradigm shift. And I think we need to see all this within the lens of health and social care. And we need to create a bottom-up movement where we take this issue to the public and we try to create an energy towards a more rational approach to drugs, and one that is fit for purpose and one that's fitting for this 2025 and not 1950. Thank you.